Here's a great Bible question. How do scholars know that Paul is indeed a historical figure? And we can broaden this out to ask, how do scholars in any field that bumps up against history know that anybody is a historical figure? Well, there are several criteria that historians and scholars in these fields routinely use in order to try and establish a person or even an event is indeed historical. And these criteria are that we have multiple, independent, early, non-contradictory sources, ideally with a high degree of historical verisimilitude, and even more ideally, some embarrassing material in them for whoever is composing or preserving these texts. If we have sources like this for a figure or event, then most historians and other scholars besides are going to presume that that figure or event is historical unless we have some reason to think otherwise. And we have these kinds of sources for Paul between his letters and the narrative in Acts. There are multiple independent, early, and non-contradictory, at least with respect to his existence, and they have historical verisimilitude and some embarrassing material included in there as well. People often mess up this non-contradictory bit when it comes to talking about the historicity of Jesus. There are a lot of people who are skeptical about the historicity of Jesus, even though far and away the vast majority of biblical scholars and historians believe that Jesus existed. People are often skeptical because they think that if they commit to the historical existence of Jesus, that they need to commit to some validity for Christianity and its truth claims, but that's not the case. But people will sometimes say, well, I'm skeptical about Jesus' existence because the Gospels contradict so much. They do contradict a lot. They contradict about the circumstances surrounding Jesus' birth, about the specific nature of his teachings and the miracles he performed, about the specific sequence of events in his life. But they don't contradict about the fact that Jesus existed, right? And if that's the particular claim that we're looking at, did Jesus exist? They don't contradict about that. And so they do count as multiple independent, early, relatively as far as history is concerned, and non-contradictory sources with respect to that particular feature of his narrative. These historical criteria are also why it's difficult for scholars and historians to affirm the existence of somebody like Moses from the Hebrew Bible, because he simply, or the stories about him, simply don't meet as many of these criteria. And we do have multiple independent sources about Moses' life. This is actually one of those interesting instances where something like the documentary hypothesis that affirms that there's multiple independent sources underlying the Pentateuch is actually better for the apologist than the standard sort of conservative evangelical line that these texts were composed by Moses, in a very singular and univocal sort of way. Because if we admit something like the documentary hypothesis, then we have multiple sources to the life of Moses, independent sources about the life of Moses. But Moses' life does not meet these other requirements. They're not early, even by historical standards. The stories that we have about the life of Moses are written centuries to perhaps a millennia after Moses' life, and at that point, they have very little historical value. There's also very little historical verisimilitude in these stories. They look like legendary stories. They have all the attributes of legendary stories, so that doesn't help very much either. The stories about Moses also contradict in ways that are relevant for his existence. So, for example, using biblical data, you could reason out that Moses existed in the 15th century BCE, but using biblical data, you can also reason out that he existed in the 13th century BCE. That's a contradiction relevant to a person's historical existence when the sources can't agree even in the century in which the character was supposed to have lived.